And it's actually everything to this point in the ancient world was done at home until about the 8th century when a prayer book was instituted. All this was done at home. And where we find ourselves at this point is the picking up of the last bracha, Yishtabach, which you have if you were able to download it in advance. I hope you have that in front of you. So we closed the preliminary service, the preliminary portions of the service with the recitation of Yishtabach. Since we stood up for the opening bracha of Baruch She'emar, that opens this section, and it finishes up with a blessing, we stand for the blessing that closes it, Yishtabach. Those are the bookends to this part of the service, and we rise for both pieces of it. The text contains. All right, let's look at the text itself. So we have. Let's see. Somebody want to read? There we go. Thank you. All right. Sandy, you want to read the English there?
You shall ever be praised in heaven and on earth, our sovereign, the great and holy God. Songs of praise and psalms of adoration become you, Adonai, our God and God of our ancestors. Praises that acknowledge your grandeur, your glory, your might, your magnificence, your strength, your sanctity, and your sovereignty. Now and forever acclaim and honor are yours. Praised are you, Adonai, sovereign of wonders, crowned with adoration, delighting in our songs and psalms, exalted ruler, eternal life of the universe.
All right. So first of all, there's nothing controversial about this text. Like last week we dealt with the Song of the Sea. That had issues. There's no issues here. This one's easy. Couple things to point out here. Number one, you see in the red, there is this series of 15 synonyms. 15 synonyms of praise for God. This was a style of poetry that entered Jewish prayer, and particularly in the late biblical period, it entered all forms of prayer. So you have here, you had it in the English, you have your glory, your might, your magnificence, your strength, your sanctity, on and on and on and on. In the Hebrew shir, Shvachah Halel v'Zimra, my dog, I got to shut my dog up. Hold on one second. All right, buddy. All right. I forgot to shut the shutters, so that he was staring out and barking at everybody that came by. All right. All right, so you have these synonyms that play out. The repetitive nature of the praise of God in this text suggests, in a sense, how ultimately it is hopeless for finite human beings to relate to God's infinite greatness. Through this repetition, we're suggesting that God's qualities are immeasurable and they are untellable. And so you have this constant repetition. This plays out. We see this in a number of places throughout our service. As a summary prayer, which again this is, the central image of the Pesukei de Zimra is God's kingship. And I pointed out, it both starts and ends with that message, this paragraph. It starts out in the yellow, Ha'el HaMelech, the Lord, the King. And at the end, all it does is reverse those two, King, Lord, Melech El. It's clear what the central message is that they're trying to convey, and that's God's kingship. As a matter of fact, in different forms, you'll find God's rulership in this paragraph 5 times. You'll find Melech 4 times and Memshalah, ruler, a 5th time. So that it's clear what the theme is. All right. Hope everybody's there. Okay, there we go. The last 2 words of the paragraph, Chei HaOlamim. Also, there's an essential message that is being conveyed here. God is not referred to as Sur Olamim, the first cause, creative and active once. This theme I keep repeating. It's deism, where God created the world and stepped out of it. But no, it's deliberately saying not Sur Olamim, but Chei HaOlamim. God is the life, the constant living source of all activity, a perpetual power that invades our lives and dispenses life to all within the world. All right? And so there's some subtle messages within this small little paragraph. Of God's kingship, we have the fact that God is eternal and God is continually involved in our lives. and we have this string of synonyms conveying that ultimately God's praise is beyond anything we can list. All within the one paragraph, all ending the whole text of the preliminary service. So, we talked about it started with Baruch She'emar and it ends here. It's conceived as one unit, and tradition says you don't engage in conversation at any point during this time. Okay? Now, mind you, when the rabbis talked about this, they included no amens. You don't say amen, that's an interruption. You certainly didn't do page announcements. Modern life has sort of forced us to do that, but the rabbis intended that there would be no page announcements during this time. All right, because it was seen as a break in the text. Now, not only is that true of the preliminary sections, but also it's a prelude into the Shacharit itself, which we're about to begin with Baruch Hu. And the rabbis wanted absolutely no breaks between Chei HaOlamim and Baruch Hu. And for that reason, the leader of the next set, can you hear me? Something wrong? Okay. Somebody give me a thumbs up that you can hear me. Okay, good. For that reason, the person who's doing Shacharit doesn't start with Baruch Hu. They didn't want interruptions. He starts on mornings with Yishtabach, on weekday mornings, or on Shabbat, a couple paragraphs. There's a few sections that are added for Shabbat, starting with Shochen Ad. So the leader of the service, who's going to do the main service, starts early to prevent any disruptions or any moments of break so that people don't engage in conversation. All right? As a matter of fact, in case there was any question, the Palestinian Talmud has a midrash which describes a rabbi saying the following. I was out for a walk once when I ran into Elijah the prophet, and with him were 4,000 camels, all loaded with a heavy burden. What are these camels carrying, I asked. And he answered, they are carrying the fury and the anger to pay back people who talk between the end of Pesukei de Zimra and the beginning of the Shema and its blessings. Clearly, I mean, obviously this is metaphorical, but it's clearly conveying the message. This is not the time to be engaged in conversation. Okay? At this point, the warm-up is now concluded. We are fully ready to go into prayer. Everybody has changed their mindset from the outside world into actual engagement with God. The liturgy can begin. And traditionally at this point, the role of leading becomes far more important. It's no longer warm-up, it's actual prayer. And that's why in most congregations, the cantor would pick up here. Okay, everything prior to this was a warm-up. Now we're actually engaging in prayer. And that's why the cantor would start here. All right. Any questions on that? I don't see any hands. I'm looking, I don't see. Okay. All right, let's go on. Chatzi Kaddish. No prayer is as widely known among Jews, at least by name, as the Kaddish, and at the same time, no prayer is more thoroughly misunderstood. Okay, well known, misunderstood. The Kaddish is a prayer of praising and sanctifying God and expressing a hope for the establishment of God's kingship upon earth. That's its message. All right. You can see I highlighted in the yellow in the first paragraph, Gadal is great. Be it Kadash, holy. Shem, Shmei is shame, is God's name. V'yamlich melech, and b'chayechon, in the lives. Okay? That is its message, okay? Is God's greatness and holiness in our world, all right? And God's rulership. That's the prayer. When this all came together as a prayer is not clear. What is clear is it didn't develop at one time. It has been added to and added to and added to over the years, all right? So let's take a second. Sarah Norris, would you read for us the English on Kaddish so we have a sense of what we're talking about?
May God's name be exalted and sanctified throughout the world that God created, as is the Lord's wish. May God's sovereignty soon be accepted during our life and the life of all Israel, and let us say amen.
Amen.
May God's great name be praised throughout all time. Can you scroll up? Oh, well, I can do it here.
There you go.
Okay, glorified and celebrated, lauded and worshipped, exalted and honored, extolled and acclaimed. May the Holy One be blessed beyond all song and psalm, beyond all tributes that human beings can express, and let us say amen.
All right, I hadn't even had this in my notes, but as I'm looking at it, I realize it's another one of this list of synonyms, okay? Mm-hmm. You've got worshiped, exalted, honored, extolled, acclaimed. It's again, that is a poetic form of the liturgy from an early date, okay? What we do know is that the oldest section of the Kaddish is the central line, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach Li'alam L'Amei Maya. That is the original line. This sentence, which is in Aramaic, is found in the Talmud and in rabbinic sources. And at the time of the first temple, when the priests would pronounce God's holy name, whatever the name actually was, the people who stood in the courts of the temple would bless God's name in a response that was similar to this line. After the destruction of the temple, the name was no longer pronounced, but nonetheless, when the greatness and holiness, the first two words of this prayer, of God's name is declared in an assembly, the people would continue to respond with this formulaic series of words. Okay? The entire purpose of Kaddish is to encourage people to say that one line. Okay? That's the core message. Again, anytime we praise God in this formal capacity, we do so with a minyan. It's a public declaration, and therefore you need a minyan. All right? And we're not ready for that yet. I'll get to there. Okay, thank you, Maya. She's anticipating. She's good. She's anticipating. Okay. And the first paragraph conveys just such a message. Great, holy establishment of God's kingdom in our times. That creates the opportunity for people to respond with Yehei Shmei Rabbah. That is the whole purpose. And these first four words, Yehei Shmei Rabbah, Yikadal v'Yikadash Shmei Rabbah, are an adaptation out of Ezekiel, of a text in Ezekiel, where it says, "Thus will I manifest my greatness and my holiness, and make myself known in the sight of many nations, and they shall know that I am Adonai." So again, it's built on biblical premise. So when did this idea of saying Kaddish start? All right. The first time we have mention of it is during the 2nd century of the Common Era. Okay. Yosef ben Halafta established a school for teaching Torah, attracting some of the most brilliant young scholars of the day. And it's he who records in his time that it was the custom to close every lecture or sermon with a prayer sanctifying God's name and voicing the hope that the days of the Messiah would soon be coming. That was the goal. And to this closing prayer, so they would study, a prayer would be, say, declaring God's greatness, and everybody would respond, Amen, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach. Okay, it was a response to study, all right? And that is the source, okay? So it's important, and I'll show you why when we get to the Mourner's Kaddish, how that's really significant. So the question is, why is it not in Hebrew? And there are a number of ways to know this is in Aramaic right off the bat, that it's not Hebrew. In Hebrew, a lot of words would finish with a hey, and here you'll see a lot of alepphs. All right, you'll see Yehei Shmei Rabbah, Yehei in the middle. It's an aleph at the end. That's one of the first ways one would know that it's in Aramaic. It's a cognate language, the same letters, but it's like Spanish and English again. Same letters, different language. Okay, and indeed, since the study itself was in Aramaic, they would study in the local text, like we're studying in English. The response was then given in Aramaic in terms of the prayer. And so Kaddish was written in the Aramaic. And from the house of study, it wasn't a big step that it would some way find its way into the synagogue itself. And so that's what it did ultimately. It became part of our service. But its initial form was really a response to study. And I've mentioned before that there are 5 versions of the Kaddish. The Kaddish de Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish, is its initial form. That was its purpose, a response to study. We have the half Kaddish, which serves as a comma. Now, I've talked to you about the overall structure of what we're praying, and I've mentioned the structure, and then 2, that a service technically must include an Amidah. All right, so we call it a preliminary service. That's modern parlance, but it's really not a service. It's an introduction into the Shacharit, which has an Amidah. So therefore, what we would do in between is put a comma. You have a half Kaddish. The same thing, the Torah service is really not a service. There's no Amidah. It's a prelude to Musaf. So as we go from the Torah service into Musaf, we have a half Kaddish, a comma. The full Kaddish has the last 3 lines, Tikabel Tzolot Va'uton Dechol Beit Yisrael, and Oseh Shalom after it, 3 lines there. That is a period. And so where does it appear? At the end of Shacharit, right after the Amidah, and at the end of Musaf, right after the Amidah. Those are the periods. The service, a service by definition, must contain the Amidah. Okay? We call lots of things services in modern language. We call it a shofar service for the high holidays. It's really not. It's a series of prayers that connect to a theme, but it's not a service. There's no Amidah. We call the martyrology a service. We call the avodah a service. They're not, in the traditional sense of it, a full service because there's no Amidah contained within them. Okay? So in those cases, what you would see to break up the service is the half Kaddish. When you finish, the full Kaddish makes more sense. Okay? It's your periods of the service. Let's talk about Mourner's Kaddish a little bit, because here's one that everybody knows. If you know anything about Judaism, people know Mourner's Kaddish. This is whether or not they know all the words, they know what it means. They understand its point. All right. For parents, it is said for 11 months. For brothers, sisters, wives, and spouses, it is said for 30 days. After 30 days, your mourning period is over for anybody other than a parent. Traditionally, mourning was 30 days. That's what they mourned for Moses. For a parent, they understood that it was a different relationship in the following way. In every other relationship, a spouse, a sibling, a child, all right, there is either an equality of relationship or the parent is in the role of the giver. In the case of a parent, the parent has given you something that you can never repay, and so you owe them differently. And so what they did is they extended the Kaddish from 30 days for a parent to 11 months. The standard is 30 days. For a parent, it was extended to 11 months. Okay. It essentially is a public statement embracing God, saying, God, you are great despite my loss. There is no mention of death here at all. It is, God, you are awesome. Gee, God, your hair smells terrific. This is, God is wonderful. And when someone stands up and says this after a loss, essentially what they're doing is putting aside their own personal sufferings to declare God's greatness. Now, the use of it as a mourner's Kaddish, the use of Kaddish by mourners probably didn't develop until the 13th century. Now, this is key. This is where we go back to what I said earlier. When someone died, the way in which you honored them was to study. So you would finish the service, and the rabbi or whoever was leading would lead a study session. That was the way in which you honored somebody. What would be the natural thing to say after you finished the study session? Kaddish. God is great. Somewhere along the way, the study got lost and Kaddish took the place of the study. But the Kaddish is really was not used in its initial form as anything to do with mourning. The honor of the person was done through study. And Kaddish was just a follow-up on the study. We take it differently. We understand it differently today. All of us, when we had a loss, this is how we respond, but that's not its origins. That's not its origins originally, okay? The fifth form, as I've mentioned to you before, there's a special Kaddish that's said at the cemetery. It's fallen out of use in most communities. I honestly don't even know it. I'd have to go back and go searching for it. It's really not part of our vocabulary per se in terms of our world today, outside of the very, very traditional. All right, Maya, let's go up now to rules for Kaddish. All right. So the first thing, as I mentioned before, you need a minyan. We're declaring God's greatness. You need to have a quorum. All right. And by the way, when I say a minyan, obviously originally it was talking about men. Now we include women in our world. I often would say to the kids when I would teach this, but it's not just 10 people gathered, because 10 people gathered to play baseball is not a minyan. It's 10 people with a focus. So when you have 10 people who are engaged in prayer, you can have a minyan. If you have 9 people engaged in prayer and one person sitting there reading something else, you don't have a minyan. It's not the sheer presence of a human being. It's 10 people engaged in prayer. All right? It follows either a psalm, a study session, which we talked about, a psalm, or a prayer that needs a minyan. Okay, so we have the Amidah, requires a minyan, we say Kaddish. You'll notice when we do a Shiva minyan, and at the end we say Kaddish, the rabbi always then follows up with a reading of a psalm, Psalm 23, and then says Kaddish again. That psalm is the enabler. You need that psalm to enable one to recite Kaddish again. Okay? Those reciting Kaddish must rise. Can you rise if you're not saying Kaddish? There's all sorts of traditions. It's not that there's no halacha here about who else has to rise or shouldn't, and it's a personal choice. There are two arguments. On the one hand, if everybody rises, they're saying Kaddish for those who don't have someone to say Kaddish for, and there's value in that. But there's also value in being able to determine who is in a period of mourning, and if they stand when everybody else is not standing, you can see who needs comfort. So both are legitimate values, and we could have that debate for years and years and years. In the Reform movement, everybody tends to stand because they emphasize the first. In traditional communities, it's the second we emphasize. There's no right and wrong here, and there's no halakha about it, other than those who are saying Kaddish must stand. Leslie.
But I think also the idea of the whole congregation standing is also to say a Kaddish for the 6 million.
That's been added. There's no halakha on that again, because number one, the rabbis weren't writing halakha. They wrote it many thousands of years before the Holocaust. And that became one response of saying it. Okay, and is that eternal? At what point do you stop doing that? How many people are saying Kaddish for those who died in the Inquisition? How many people are saying Kaddish for those who died in the destruction of the temple? At what point do you stop that? I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. I'm asking sort of a rhetorical question.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe the answer is after all the Holocaust survivors are gone. I don't know. But at some point, historically, we stopped saying Kaddish for those who died in the Inquisition, so we probably stopped saying Kaddish for those who died in the Holocaust on a parallel level. Okay? Couple other things. Kaddish has to be said by certain people. The 7 we've talked about, it's father, mother, sister, brother, husband, wife, and child. It's a spouse and son and daughter. So there's 7 relationships. But it may be said, I'll tend to. Okay, Eric, I'll answer your question in a second. But minors may say it. There's an obligation of who must. There's not a prohibition from minors saying it. Daughters may recite Kaddish as well. There's no prohibition against saying it per se. Now, the one thing I often get asked by people, I'm a grandchild, can I say can I say Kaddish? Can I sit Shiva? Particularly, can I sit Shiva? And my answer to them in that one is you may, but if you're sitting Shiva, who's caring for the mourners? The children. Somebody has to take on that responsibility. So although, yes, you as a grandchild are suffering, it's your responsibility to take care of the children of the deceased. And so although there is anybody who's lost a grandparent and then lost a parent, you know there's a difference. All right? There's a difference in the loss that one experiences. Both are terrible, but there's a degree that is different. Eric asked the question, do the 10 have to be part in the same room, etc.? So, until COVID-19, my answer would have been yes. What we're seeing in our world today with one, a new situation, a chidush, and two, new available technology, which didn't exist in the past, suddenly you're seeing rabbinic responses. Outside of Shabbat, you're seeing it happening even in the Orthodox world. Okay, that they're using 10 people if they can be seen and heard, etc. Again, I'm not sure in the ultra-Orthodox world they're using it, but certainly the modern Orthodox world they are. And so we're sort of seeing something new. The question will be, after COVID-19, when we return to real life, is this just a ruling for the specific disastrous time that will no longer be valid post? That it's only an emergency ruling, or will it maintain itself? I don't have answers for that. I'll let far greater minds than mine resolve that. Can Kaddish be said for friends? The answer is yes. As I said to you, there's no, the requirement is those 7 relationships you must. There's no law saying others can't be said, others can't recite it. However, again, be sensitive to the fact in so doing, you're sort of taking away from this specialness of the relationship of the 7. And that's a balance. They're both good values. Both are good values, and you're balancing one against the other. Hold on one second. Janice, I saw your question. Let me go back to it 1 second. And that was, what about the addition of Vial Kol, Yoshvei Tevel, in the concluding line? That's a modern sensitivity. Vial Kol, Yoshvei Tevel is essentially saying, instead of just the people of Israel, all the people of the world. In a modern world where we're actually received relatively well, the anti-Semitism we experience today is relatively minor compared to what we've experienced throughout history. We tend to be more inclusive, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with including it. Throughout history, I don't think that's what most people were feeling as they were being tortured and beaten, etc. They weren't looking to reach out and be inclusive. To the contrary. So there's nothing wrong with it. It's not a part of the traditional text because of the context in which these things were written in the earliest times. Most of Jewish history is times of anti-Semitism. It's only the last 70 years that are really deviant, when we can feel comfortable in the world. All right. The last thing to note about, shouldn't be said for relatives who are not Jews. If you're Jewish and your relatives are not, my answer to that, I'm not going to give you a halakhic answer because I can't. But my instinct is to say, yes, you're the mourner. It's about you standing up, because you're really not saying it for the deceased. You're praising God. There's no mention of death here. You're praising God despite your loss. And so you as a Jew, it's about you, not the deceased. You consider it sacrilegious? Yes. The question arose is, what about over pets? Now, everybody, if you've talked to me for more than probably a few minutes, I have a dog. I'm an animal lover. Buddy when Buddy goes, I'm going to be devastated. But there is a distinction in the life of a human being and a pet. And that's sacrilegious is a far more intense word than I would use. I would rather say it's probably something I wouldn't encourage. Will the world end if you do so? Of course not. Of course not. Yes, Leslie.
I will say a precious moment. When Edward was in high school at HSPVA and performing, a very dear friend of hers of his in the class was in a car crash. And we went to the hospital, and he had tubes and everything there, and he could only come into the edge of the room to visit. And then as we left that room down the hallway, he says, "Mom, can we say Kaddish for my friend?" And we did.
Yeah, again, I said to you, it's not that you can.
In that sense. But maybe this will help my friend.
Okay, let me again make the point, because Janice is asking a parallel question as well. There is the chovah. There is that which you are obligated to.
Mm-hmm.
What you are obligated to is those 7 relationships. And it's 30 days for anybody but a parent, is the chovah, the obligation. There's a difference between an obligation and what can one do. In other words, do many people say Kaddish for a child who they lose a child for 11 months? Do they say Kaddish for a sibling? The answer is many people do. It's not necessarily a chovah, it's not an obligation upon you, but it's an opportunity that you may choose to embrace. There's a distinction. Yes, Sandy.
What? Repeat again the 7 relationships, please.
Okay, father, mother,
Mm-hmm.
sister, brother, son, daughter, spouse. So it's parent, sibling, child, spouse.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. In all the others, can you say Kaddish? The answer is yes. Do you have an obligation to say Kaddish? The answer, outside of what I've described, the answer is no. They're 2 different things. Okay? So yeah, do not feel any guilt for having said Kaddish for a friend. Do not feel any guilt for having said it for longer. Do not feel guilt for any of that. The question is, were you obligated? That's a different question. Okay? And Judaism, Judaism has in the Pirkei Avot, it's very clear. That which is done because you're obligated to do it is of greater value than when you choose to do it. That Pirkei Avot teaches that. And because they're trying to make the point of an obligation to God is a direct response to what God is demanding of you. Okay? You don't have to agree. You don't have to disagree. That's what Pirkei Avot teaches. All right. I have a couple of questions here for discussion. And for this, so I'm going to unmute everybody, and we can kind of go around a little bit. So the first question I put on this page was, do you agree with the practice that some people follow of paying to have Kaddish said for a relative rather than going and saying it themselves? So if you raise your hand, hopefully I'll see you and take any comments. I don't. Yes, Sandy. I don't. And Sandy, and then Janice. Go ahead. You muted yourself, Sandy. You muted yourself. Hold it. Hold. Yeah, you muted yourself.
Listen.
Sandy, we can't hear you. All right, Janice.
Okay. Yeah, I was just. Let me just say, when my dad's sister died.
Mm-hmm.
But his parents were living. He and his brothers did not want to say Kaddish while their parents were living, so they paid Rabbi Kahana to say Kaddish for his sister.
Okay. I'm not going to judge it. Good. Okay, Janice.
So I think I agree with what you said before, which is that the Kaddish is for the living.
Mm-hmm.
We say it on behalf of our relationship with the deceased. And I understand the reason for the obligation, but to pay someone else Kaddish, to me, seems like someone is not taking responsibility to experience their own grief and to experience their own relationship with the deceased. They're deferring that relationship to another person. And since I think the Kaddish is about a relationship, it's about a relationship with God, and it's about a relationship with the deceased, that to pay somebody else, it's like, that relationship is not important to me, but it might be important to someone else. So.
Yeah, very valid. Very valid. Cyril, you need to unmute yourself though. There you go.
I didn't mute myself. I've never muted myself my whole life.
Having shared a Melton class together, I would agree you shared your thoughts.
Ask my wife, she'll disagree. So, couple things. First, as Mignon said, we grew up in an Orthodox shul and women didn't say Kaddish.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a conservative thing that women say Kaddish, or is it, how does it pertain to the Orthodox?
Okay. So if you remember, I gave you the statement out of Pirkei Avot that it's better to do something out of obligation than choice. Okay?
Right.
Within the Orthodox world, they would say that which is obligated, therefore, is a far higher value, and therefore those who aren't obligated shouldn't do it. That's not my stance.
Okay, so they would say women cannot say Kaddish.
That's correct, on that basis, correct.
Okay, and yeah, the other thing about getting someone to say Kaddish for you, the implication is then, and it's in direct contradiction to what you were saying, the implication is then you are saying it, and that's how we always perceived it, you are saying it for the person, not for yourself.
So even though the words have nothing to do with death and have nothing to do with the deceased, it has taken on overtones, as you've just described, that aren't necessarily conveyed in the words, but nonetheless over history it's absorbed the sense of there's a relationship. Because Janice kind of just said this, that it has to do with the relationship between you and the deceased in some way. That's not there in the prayer, but those overtones have been laid there. Whoever's got a phone, can we ask you to mute? It's just become a part of it, and so therefore it is said for the deceased at this point. But if you remember what I said to you earlier, in its initial form, it was said during a study session following somebody's death, because the study session was in their honor. And what would you do following a study session? You'd say Kaddish. Kaddish had nothing to do with the death. It was the study session. Somewhere along the way, the study session got lost and we said Kaddish for the deceased. That's become our modern application of its original form. Yes. Cyril.
Is it me?
Mignon.
Mignon.
Yeah.
When my father had 4 daughters and we were Orthodox,
Right.
we would have had to pay some man to say Kaddish.
Right.
Not because we didn't feel a relationship with our father, but because it just wasn't done.
That's exactly.
Kaddish.
So I suspect that the paying for somebody to say Kaddish came out of 2 possible sources. One is exactly what you've just described in the Orthodox world, and when there were only daughters left behind, and the tradition in that world was that only men said Kaddish, one would pay to have it done. A second possibility was war. People were at war and they didn't have the time to have a minyan and stop in the middle of war and say Kaddish. So they would pay somebody to do it for them in such a setting. Okay? And so in that world, there's a logic to it. I outside of that world, I think that argument is lost. But that's a personal opinion. And again, there's a difference between what is required and what is the choice. Go ahead, Cyril.
One quick thing. When I said Kaddish for both parents for a year, there were 1 or 2 occasions where I was unable to, being on a plane or something. I was given the impression, obviously erroneously, that it was fine because my brother was saying Kaddish. So kind of he covered for me. But in actual fact, that's not appropriate because it was my relationship, nothing to do with my brother.
To some extent, that's correct. But look, there's also practical realities in life. You know, again, in the ancient world, they didn't find themselves on planes. Okay? Yeah. You know, if you're on a donkey, you get off the donkey and you say Kaddish, with a group of people. On a plane, unless you're on El Al, that's just not an opportunity.
Right.
All right. And so, modern world has lots of positives that go with it, a lot of positives in the medical technologies and all the kinds of things we have. There are some new challenges that we sometimes we can't do what we would have done. Right? There's no way around that. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm going to go to the Baruch Hu. All right. So at this point, again, Maya, if you would mute everybody, we'll continue on. If you look at page 4, look at the next page, the Baruch Hu here. As I said to you before, most of the preliminary prayers until about 1,500 years ago were recited at home prior to attending the synagogue service. And therefore, you would walk into the service at this point, and there would be this formal call to prayer. We still refer to the Baruch Hu as a call to prayer. It's as if you're all walking in. I remember I went and I did a lesson at an Episcopal school, all right, for students in the school, and I was absolutely amazed. These are high school students. I walk in with their minister. The minister, they're all chatting, and he says, "Let us pray," and the room falls silent. Now, I want to know what the magic to that is. That's the first thing. Okay, I've never seen Jews do that. But essentially, that was his call to worship. All right? What Baruch Hu serves is the purpose. This, again, is that response to hearing God's name. And the Baruch, you have Baruch here, praised or blessed. I highlighted Hamivorach. I highlighted the word Baruch is there too. It's just in the passive form. You have Baruch is to praise. Hamivorach is the passive, is to be praised. Okay, both are there. Okay, and what needs to be done here in every form this ever occurs. This shows up in the Torah service as well, and it makes me crazy because people can't seem to remember. The leader says the first line, the congregation says the second line, and then the leader must repeat the second line. In the Torah blessings, you don't go on to the following bracha until you've repeated that second line. It's a way of saying, I as the leader am also part of the congregation. I don't set myself aside from the congregation. So you must repeat it to communicate no exclusion. Again, you need a minyan. You can't call a community together without a quorum. You don't have no community, you have no call to the community. All right, when you say this prayer, when the leader says the first line, the leader bows from the waist, not the entire congregation. It is the leader who bows. And then when the congregation says the second line, they bow. And then again, when the leader repeats it, he bows once again. You repeat it, you bow when you're saying the line. So if the rabbi is leading Baruch Hu tomorrow morning and he says Baruch Hu and he bows, you don't bow with him. You bow when you say the second line. All right? And again, the term Baruch comes from the word berech, meaning knee, and reflects this reflects the historical practice of dropping to one's knees before a monarch to acknowledge the sovereignty. We've just talked about God's kingship, Melech El Melech, God's kingship. We're bowing before the King of Kings, Melech Malchei Amlachim. All right. Okay. The question comes up: how can we bless God? All right. How can a human being bless that which is the source of all blessings? And so you see, I put praise in there because Baruch is often translated as praised as well because of that specific. It's a difficulty in how do I extend blessings to God. Even when I'm saying Yivarechecha, and for the congregation, I'm not blessing anybody. I'm extending God's blessings upon them. Okay, so again, this comes down to how we it's a metaphor. How we understand relationships with human beings is a parallel to how we understand our relationship with God. Members of a family bless one another. We do that on Friday night. Parents bless their children. Subjects bless a king. And so we, in a sense, offer that same message to God, but really the key fact is the Hamivorach. What we're doing is saying God is already blessed. We're just recognizing it. We're not really blessing God. We're recognizing the fact that he is already blessed. And so either we do it that way or we say praise God who is already praised. All right? That's the call to worship. We're now into the actual service. Go to the next page. The next section, and we're just going to touch on a few things here today, contains the Shema and its blessings. All right, go up a little bit, Maya, just so you can get rid of the title at the top of your Shema. Okay, so it has the following sections. I know if you've heard me speak, you've heard me talk about creation, revelation, redemption. Those are the three. Creation, God is the creator. God is the revealer of Torah, revelation, and God is the redeemer, the Geulah. I put in red, there are three blessings that surround the Shema in the morning. The Yotzer, God forms, God creates. Ahava Rabbah, great love. How is God's love manifested? It is manifested in the giving of Torah. That is the expression of God's love. And ultimately, the third is God is redeemer and protector of Israel, both in past times and then hopefully in future times as well. In between those three blessings is Shema. And the Shema has the opening line, the first paragraph, again, a love and devotion to God, the second paragraph, reward and punishment in this world, and the third, the duty of observing God's commandments. All right? That is one long unit. Once again, one does not break this up with any, from a traditional standpoint, with any interruptions at all. So even to say Amen is not acceptable here. To say Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo is not acceptable here. In a modern, in traditional, they wouldn't announce pages because that would be seen as non-halachic. People would be expected to be able to follow. That's not necessarily true in our world, and so we do page announcements, but it's almost sort of tongue-in-cheek because we realize we shouldn't be doing it. We're doing it out of necessity. Okay. Sometimes I noticed last week Martin led Shacharit, and before he got to the Amidah, there's a specific requirement not to, the blessing right before the Amidah, Ga'al Yisrael, going into the Amidah, you're not supposed to break that. So what he did is he announced the Amidah a page earlier, so he wouldn't have to break between. So it's clear he understood what's going on. But as much as possible, there to be no breaks here. And even Amen is seen as a break. Okay? I want to go one more thing. And then I'll let everybody go. All right. Go down one more line. One more, yeah. You have here the blessing that follows the Baruch Hu. Now, a couple key things I want to talk about. Number one, this is part of the next section. It's not part of Baruch Hu. And the Shulchan Aruch therefore states one should be seated when reciting this line to convey that it's not part of the Baruch Hu, but part of the blessing that follows. To make a distinction that it's not part of Baruch Hu. All right? So Shulchan Aruch says one should be seated when one says these two lines. All right? Except for the last word. This is a direct quotation from Isaiah. And it says, God who creates light and fashions darkness according to the order of all creation. What it really says in the Hebrew here is God forms light and creates darkness. God makes shalom, completeness, tranquility, and creates everything. That's what the Hebrew is actually saying that's in front of you. They've made it pretty here. The biblical verse in Isaiah, what it says is the following. God who forms light and creates darkness, God who establishes peace and creates evil. Uvorei et hara. All right, now one can also translate that as trouble. Whatever it is, it's the opposite of shalom. Light and darkness are meant to be a contrast. Shalom and ra there are meant to be a parallel contrast. It's the opposite of whatever shalom means, tranquility. So God is being recognized as the creator of all the negative in the world, okay? Obviously, those who designed the Siddur were uncomfortable to some level. And so what they did is they cleaned it up and said, God is the creator of everything, which obviously also includes the negative, but doesn't say it directly. It's a nicer way of saying it. All right. And what is being said here, what the ultimate message here is, this is a response to Persian dualism. In Persia, they believed that there was a God of good and light and a different God of darkness and evil. For Jews to stand up and say, Shema Yisrael, there is one God, that's clear. That's our basic tenet of the Jews' belief. But with that comes an absolute rejection of any power in the universe to be able to create evil. So this is implied in the statement of God's unity. The fact that evil can exist has to be attributed. It's a problem. It's probably the most difficult problem that modern religion has, is how to understand this. What did Christianity do? They created a second being. They created a devil. Judaism, in the same way it rejects the Trinity, rejects this concept of a power that can go beyond God's power. A challenge to God is not a possibility. When you say God is one, God is responsible for everything. I'm going to leave it there very deliberately. Next week, I'm going to spend most of our lesson on the concept of suffering and evil in the world and a Jewish response to it. Because when we say this line, Vorei et Hakol, it is meant to evoke that struggle. It is not just a bunch of words. All right?